Top 5 Most Painful Cave Deaths of All Time. Crooked Swamp Incident. The event in the Crooked Swamp on March 27, 1982, Donald Weltner and his two sons, Christopher and Roger, were set to lead a group of 12 Boy Scouts on a day of cave exploration. This was not Donald's first time caving, and he was not overly worried because he was bigger than the other participants, and if he could make it through the notoriously narrow passages in the Crooked Swamp cave system, the rest of the group could. Since they were not sure which passages would be too narrow, Donald decided to check one that involved a tight squeeze, but seemed to open to another section. The squeeze, which measured 18 by 20 inches and was so tight that he could not move his arms backwards or raise his head to see ahead, was so tight that he was unable to push through it. At 2 o'clock, they entered the cave through its 16 by 28-inch entrance and stopped in a room inside. His boys were following him, and as he proceeded, he informed them of the situation since the mud made the ground slick. Everything appeared normal until an unexpected event happened, and as he pulled himself forward, he noticed that the earth beneath him was vanishing. Donald was unable to stop his slide because of the slippery mud after he fell into a narrow crack. He had no leverage to raise himself since his hands were stuck. The situation was made worse by the fact that the path was about 30 degrees slanted, which meant he had to fight gravity. The crevice was only 5 inches wide, and the slick mud made his body settle more and more. He instructed his sons to pull on his feet, but after multiple unsuccessful attempts, he told them to get the other adult in the cave, Jim. Jim eventually realized they would not be able to free Donald on their own, and Donald explained that some rocks had loosened when he slid and were now wedging against his body. Every time they attempted to pull him back, the loose rocks would slide forward. After Jim left the cave to call for assistance, the police and cave rescue specialists arrived. Since only one person could fit into the small space at once, they attempted to free Donald using ropes, but this failed as well. They then brought in tools to try breaking some of the rocks, but hours of work produced only minor progress, and Donald's condition worsened. He was hungry, thirsty, and in a very cold environment, so hypothermia was a serious concern. In order to provide Donald with food and water, the caves thought about going in from the opposite side. However, they discovered that the passage leading to his resting place was very narrow, and only two very small caves, Sisters Lynn and Nancy Taylor, could fit. Even then, they were unable to reach Donald's head, so there was no way to deliver supplies. Therefore, the rescuers had to move quickly, and they chose to dig from above ground down to where Donald was stuck. The process took all day to get them nearly to the necessary depth. Regretfully, they had to dig laterally because they were only 12 feet from Donald's position. In the meantime, on Monday morning, Donald started to grunt, which suggested that he was probably hypothermic. 2 days after he became stuck, the team continued to dig, but they ran into another issue: extremely hard bedrock layers that were impossible to dig through. Since they were unsure whether Donald was still alive at this point, they sent a nurse into the cave with a handheld Doppler machine to check for a pulse. She was unable to find one, but since she could only access his extremely cold legs, it was not conclusive evidence of death because, given how rapidly Donald's condition was declining, sometimes the body's core organs can continue to function even after the extremities have stopped registering a pulse. Rescuers began utilizing their most dangerous equipment, such as dynamite, which seemed to be their only remaining choice. They eventually arrived at his location on Tuesday morning, and a doctor was dispatched right away. However, because many people thought Donald had passed away, it took a full day to recover his body, and an autopsy later determined that he had died of hypothermia sometime between Sunday night and Monday morning. As a result, the cave system was only partially accessible. Sturk Fontaine Cave Incident. It was September 29, 1984, a day that began like any other for 3 cave explorers, but ended in tragedy. Nuno Gomez, along with his friends Peter Verhulsel and Malcolm, stood at the entrance of South Africa's Sturkfontein Cave. They had one goal: to map the farthest parts of the wet cave system, including a deep, mysterious chamber known as Milner Hall. Nuno, the most experienced diver among them, would go in alone to lay a guideline, while Peter and Malcolm stayed above to assist. What none of them knew was that this would be the beginning of a terrifying ordeal. one that would stretch the limits of survival. Nuno slipped beneath the surface, his body cutting through the cold cave water with careful precision. The beam from his flashlight illuminated the narrow path ahead as he laid the guideline, inch by inch, through twisting, unfamiliar tunnels. After reaching Milner Hall, 396 feet from the entrance, he surfaced in a hidden air pocket, heart pounding with relief. The first phase of the mission was complete. Excited by their progress, all three men dove back in to explore the path Nuno had just created. But as they began to make their way out, something was wrong. Malcolm reached out and tapped Nuno on the shoulder. Peter was missing. Alarmed, Nuno turned back. His light cut through the water until it landed on Peter, who had wandered into a narrow side tunnel. Nuno quickly caught up, tapped him, and motioned for him to return to the main line. Peter gave a quick nod and followed, but just minutes later, he was gone again. Nuno and Malcolm paused, unsure. They figured Peter had taken a different, easier exit route to avoid the tight squeeze they had just passed. Thinking he had already surfaced, they followed the line out. But when they reached the surface, nothing. No sign of Peter, no bubbles, no sound, just silence. Panic started to build. Without wasting time, Nuno and Malcolm went back under. Their eyes scanned every inch of the guideline, every crevice, every side tunnel, but Peter had vanished. The minutes turned into hours. 4 long, exhausting hours of swimming, searching, hoping. Their air tanks were nearly empty, and visibility was quickly vanishing. Thick clouds of silt stirred up from their frantic movements, made it hard to see even a foot ahead. With heavy hearts, they resurfaced and called for help. The fire brigade arrived first, but they were not trained for cave diving. The real search could not continue until the police divers showed up later that evening. But by then, the water was almost impossible to see through. That night, the search was called off. The police no longer believed they were looking for a living person. They expected to find a body. But what no one knew was that Peter was still alive, trapped in the maze-like structure of the cave. He had accidentally taken a wrong turn into a secondary tunnel and quickly lost his sense of direction. With no guidelines to follow and silt clouding everything around him, every path looked the same. Eventually, he found a small, dry room tucked away from the main passage. Exhausted and disoriented, he decided to stay there, hoping someone would come for him. Alone in the dark chamber, Peter pointed his flashlight toward the water, hoping someone, anyone, might see the flicker and come to his rescue. Minutes passed, then hours. Still, no one came. Worried his battery would die, he reluctantly switched off the light. In the silence, he grabbed his air tank and began banging it against the rocky walls, praying the echoes would travel far enough to reach help. But the cave swallowed the sound. Exhausted, hungry, and disoriented, Peter eventually drifted into sleep, losing all sense of time. Outside, hope was fading. The police had sealed off the cave to stop further entries. But the stirred-up silt still had not settled. Visibility inside remained terrible. Searching for him was like looking through the fog in pitch black. Days passed. The police believed no one could survive that long underwater. They postponed further dives, deciding to wait an entire week before going back in. On October 6th, 7 days after Peter vanished, they returned to the water, but found nothing. Another week slipped by. Still no trace of him. Meanwhile, deep inside the cave, Peter was still holding on. 14 days without light. 14 days without food. His body weakened, weight dropping fast. Desperate, he decided to move. He left the tiny chamber and followed a narrow passage 120 feet away from the water, his last hope. But it led to a solid wall of rock, a dead end. Defeated and drained, he turned around and crawled back to his hiding spot, clinging to the hope that someone might still come. Searches continued, but only on weekends. Week after week, for 6 long weeks, police divers scoured the cave. Still nothing. Finally, they called off the search, believing there was nothing more to be done. The dry parts of the cave were reopened, but the wet sections remained closed. Then a group of volunteers stepped in, determined to solve the mystery. Among them was Nuno Gomez. He refused to give up. His experience was invaluable. Nuno helped uncover a hidden link between the dry and wet caves, a breakthrough. They followed this new path deep into the system, and that was when they saw it, a single trail of footprints leading toward a dead end. And there, at the very end of the trail, they found Peter. Beside his lifeless body was a heart-wrenching message scribbled on the cave wall. "I love you, Sherlin Ma." That was all. A final goodbye from a man who never stopped fighting. Later, they discovered that one diver had unknowingly come within 100 feet of saving him, so close yet just out of reach. The autopsy revealed the truth. Peter had not drowned. He had survived for 3 entire weeks, dying only from starvation. His choice to leave the safety of the guidelines had tragic consequences, yes, but his will to survive, alone in that dark, silent cave, is something that deserves both reflection and respect. Aegon Allwed Incident. Roger Solari and Martin Farr, aged 26 and 23, respectively sought to map out the Aegon Allwed cave system in South Wales, at the time John Parker. Another explorer had abandoned the quest after uncovering a third sump in one of its longest sections. Martin and Roger nevertheless wanted to keep on to discover what lay beyond. The first trip was done by Martin alone, because Roger had damaged his knee, making it highly unsafe for Martin to continue solo. Reaching the third sump was a feat in and of itself, because the route was not only tortuous, but also extremely long, lasting for hours. The first sump was about a mile into the cave, and Martin passed through the first 2 sumps relatively easily because they were only 249 and 82 feet long. However, the third sump was much longer, and no one had thoroughly explored it yet, so Martin could only hope he had enough air to reach the end. Fortunately, he was able to swim through it at a depth of 850 feet, and on the other side, he discovered something else intriguing: a zigzagging passage that was approximately 1,800 feet long and led to another sump. When they returned on June 15, 1974, both Martin and Roger brought extra air tanks. They successfully reached Sump 4 and started diving it with a guideline to help map the route. After about 400 feet, Roger finished his guideline, and although it was not the first time he experienced sinus problems, Martin realized he probably would not have enough air to explore it and then return. So he spent the next 4 to 5 hours heading back out, planning to wait for Roger so they could tackle Sump 4 together on the next trip. They nevertheless made the decision to proceed, and Martin then removed his own guidelines. However, they made a crucial error during cave diving: the rule of thirds for air consumption. They had already spent their first third and ought to have turned around when Roger's line ran out, because Roger had a smaller tank than Martin. If you use 1/3 of your air supply on the way in, you need another third to go out, leaving the last third as an emergency reserve. Assuming Roger would leave, Martin kept going until he reached a gravel wall of rock that might have signaled the end of the sump, and possibly an air pocket. Since he was already well past the halfway point of his tank, it was getting dangerous. So he kept going until he reached solid rock, where he confirmed there was no air pocket. He then looked for a passage to the right and explored for another 29 feet, but it ended in a dead end. When he turned around, he was surprised to see Roger still there. Martin sent a rapid indication that they needed to get back. In an attempt to find the same air pocket Martin had been looking for, Roger probably realized he did not have enough air to make it back. Martin continued to search for it for about 130 feet before his main tank ran out, forcing him to switch to a reserve tank that would only give him about 300 feet in Sump 4 and another 850 feet in Sump 3, which was hardly enough, but he had previously placed a partially filled tank between Sump 3 and Sump 2, and he attempted to reach that. When Martin finally came out of Sump 4, he sat on the bank and waited for Roger, who remembered that he had a smaller tank and that it would be a major issue if he did not show up right away. 20 minutes passed and there was still no sign of Roger. After an hour, Martin was certain that Roger's air had run out, because if he had surfaced from Sump 4 at that time, he probably would not have enough left to get through Sump 3. He tried pulling the guideline to make it tense, but it did not work. It was cut at around 430 feet, which was probably where Roger needed to change tanks because it was not an easy task at the time. He might have put his arm through the line to avoid losing it, twisted his body to reach the valve, and became tangled. Martin remained composed and went through the next 3 sumps. He immediately notified the authorities, and the search for Roger's body started. Martin and many others joined the search, but it was not until 1986 that Roger's remains were discovered. 12 years later, recovering the body was judged too dangerous, so it was left in the cave. Another explorer went through Sump 4 in 1987 and eventually found the air pocket 875 feet in the against all odds chamber, which was the exact location that Roger and Martin had planned to find. Martin claimed that following this occurrence, he never again violated the rule of thirds, and went on to have an incredible diving career. As of right now, the cave system's entrance is locked and only highly skilled divers are given keys. Floyd Collins incident. In a late December 1924 incident involving Floyd Collins found a cave called Sand Cave that was easily accessible to tourists due to its proximity to a highway. He quickly made an agreement with the landowners to receive 50% of any profits from the exploration of the cave. Floyd started working there right away because there was no notable entrance, but many tourists avoided it, so Floyd spent hours every day for the next few weeks digging deeper and deeper. It was snowing outside on January 30, 1925, and Floyd entered the cave once more to discover something startling crawling forward. He carried a lantern when he arrived at what was known as the turnaround room, which was named that way because many cave divers would stop there and turn around, deciding it was too dangerous to go any further. The only way to go further was through a tiny, narrow hole called the squeeze, which was only 9 inches high. However, Floyd was able to push through beyond the squeeze. He saw a narrow pit that dropped about 10 feet. He went down feet first, and when he reached the bottom, he discovered another pit. Squatting down, he cleared away the remaining rocks and debris, and finally he saw an opening into the main cave. He tied a rope and descended an 80-foot drop to reach the cave floor. He was in awe of the sight, but he noticed that his light was growing dim. In order to prevent himself from being left in complete darkness, he climbed back up the 80-foot drop and started to return, moving backwards and pushing his lantern with his shoulder. Unfortunately, his lantern slipped into a tiny hole and broke, leaving him in complete darkness. Floyd was aware that he needed to move carefully because the cave was very unstable and he could not see. However, he kicked one loose rock and it fell onto his left leg, trapping him. He attempted to free himself with his right leg, but as he moved, more rocks tumbled down, further securing him in place. It was 10 a.m. when he started calling for assistance, hoping that someone would hear him, and he stayed there all day. By 9 a.m. the following morning, almost 24 hours after he had become trapped, 2 of the cave's owners showed up with their 17-year-old son, Judel Estes, to see how he was doing. They noticed Floyd's coat hanging outside the cave and called his name, but no one responded, so they went deeper. Eventually, the 2 owners turned back because the passages were too narrow, but Judel persisted and eventually located Floyd, who asked him to call his brothers for assistance. Marshall Collins, Floyd's brother, and Lee Collins. Floyd's father arrived at the entrance shortly after, and they discovered a growing crowd watching the rescue effort. In order to prevent loose rocks from falling on Floyd, around 4 p.m., Marshall and another guy went inside to excavate a wider entrance. Homer arrived as Floyd's other brother. Floyd had asked Homer to accompany him that day, so Homer felt bad about turning him down and tried his best to assist. However, a new issue arose when the masses outside ignited several bonfires. Water was sent down towards Floyd in the form of freezing cold water as the ice melted and became mud in the cave. After 8 hours with Floyd, Homer's brothers had to take a nap. When he emerged, he became enraged at the large throng and told everyone to leave if they could not help, but nobody paid attention. Reporters then started to arrive in the hopes of conducting interviews. As Homer grew weary of their inquiries, he instructed them to investigate the cave for themselves. Rumors and uncertainty ensued. As further rumors circulated, Marshall offered $500,000 prize to anyone who saved his brother, despite some people claiming Floyd was already dead or that the cave had collapsed completely. But when he checked on Floyd, he discovered him alive. Floyd was able to free one hand and suggested that they tie a rope around his chest to try to pull him out. But he begged them to stop right away, stating that he felt like he was being pulled in two. Until he was completely worn out and in need of medical attention, Homer labored tirelessly to remove dirt and debris. On Tuesday night, 95 hours after Floyd had become trapped, a reporter by the name of Skeets went into the cave, and while clearing debris, put a light bulb close to Floyd. Even after Skeets revealed more of Floyd's legs, he was still unable to liberate him. His narrative and interview with Floyd were released, attracting even more viewers. Although no one realized it at the time because everyone was cheering for Floyd, the nearby hotels were packed and at least 1,000 people gathered around the sand cave, further weakening the cave walls and increasing the likelihood of its collapse. At 123 hours, the pit's entrance collapsed, preventing access to Floyd and stopping the delivery of food and water. By 144 hours, A team of workers formed to dig a new tunnel to reach him. The way they could know if Floyd was still alive was the light bulb Skeets had installed. It was connected to another bulb outside, which would flicker when Floyd breathed. They dug relentlessly, but with no food or water. Reaching Floyd, combined with the cold temperature, his chances were fading quickly. By Friday, February 13th, the men had nearly reached him, and one worker reported hearing groaning about 10 feet away, however, at 1:30 a.m. On February 6th, a worker reached Floyd and found him already deceased. Initially, Floyd's body was left in the cave after some time, though his brother Homer arranged for its removal and gave him a proper burial. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy this video, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. We hope to see you in our upcoming videos.